The wind rolled steady through the brittle grass east of Split Oak Ridge, pulling cold down from the foothills. It wasn't the kind of cold that stung all at once. It was the kind that crept in quiet, through threadbare seams and under unbuttoned sleeves, the kind that settled deep in the chest and stayed there. The late autumn dusk had dropped fast over the land, the sky already bruised with dark blue, and the sun nothing more than a faint orange smear low on the horizon. Miriam Kale stood still on the dirt road, her fingers white around her son's hand, her daughter pressed into her side. Her boots were thin and soaked near the toes, her dress too light for the hour. She had no coat, just a knitted shawl she'd thrown over her shoulders before the wagon flipped. Her face was drawn tight, not from age, but from the weight of the day. Her husband, Paul, had died that morning. The Wagonsville had split on a rut just north of Hollow Creek. The whole thing tipped sideways and landed on him before she could scream his name. She tried to pull him out, tried to make him breathe again, but the sound he made last wasn't one she'd ever forget. A thin, hollow rasp like something leaving. Now she was here, miles from anywhere familiar, without coin, food, or direction. Her only thought had been to keep walking until she saw shelter. And finally, just past the bend in the road, she saw a narrow trail that led through a clearing and toward a low fence line and a lantern flickering in a barn window. The structure stood simple and old, not abandoned, but not inviting either. It was a long, weathered building with warped pine planks and a wide door hanging crooked on its hinges. But it had a roof. That alone was enough. "Come on," she murmured to her children. The boy Isaac was 8, tired, quiet, and trying hard not to cry. He held her hand tighter than he had all day. Ruthie, barely 5, had stopped asking questions an hour ago and just walked when her mother walked. They reached the barn, and for a few seconds Miriam just stood in front of the door. Her hand hovered, unsure. She looked at her children. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't pride that made her hesitate. It was fear. Fear of being turned away. Fear of asking and hearing no. Fear of the look strangers give when they see something broken in front of them and don't want to be part of fixing it. But she knocked. The door creaked, open half a foot before she could lower her hand. On the other side stood a man she'd never seen before. He wasn't young. Late 40s, maybe early 50s at most. His face was lean, lined at the eyes, with a gray beard that hadn't been trimmed in weeks and a cut on his cheek that looked fresh, as if he'd been caught by barbed wire or a stubborn colt. His shirt was canvas and damp at the collar. His boots were worn. The revolver at his hip wasn't for show. He didn't say a word, just stood in the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the dark, looking at her, then the children, then back to her. Before Miriam could speak, her son found his voice. "Sir," Isaac said, his words tight and brave. "Can we sleep in your barn tonight?" Silence. A long one. The man didn't answer right away. His eyes held still, measuring. Not in a cruel way, not suspicious, just careful. Like someone who had learned not to speak unless it mattered. Like someone who had opened his door before and lived to regret it. Finally, without a word, he stepped aside. Miriam hesitated, just a second, but stepped forward. Inside the barn, it smelled of dry hay and old wood and horse sweat. A single lantern hung from a nail, giving off a low flicker of light. The man walked past her, grabbed a wool blanket off a hook, and tossed it near the loft ladder. "You can stay the night," he said. His voice was low and worn, not unkind but plain spoken. "Up there's dry. Don't touch the tack." That was it. Then he turned and disappeared out the side door into the dark again. Miriam helped the children climb the ladder, lifting Ruthie with a grunt. She followed them up slowly, her hands shaking from exhaustion. Once in the loft, she wrapped them both in the blanket and sat against the wall, knees to her chest, listening to the wind outside and the movement of the horses below. She didn't know who the man was. She didn't know if he'd come back or if he'd change his mind. But for now, they weren't walking anymore. She let her head fall back against the wooden wall and closed her eyes. The loft was colder than Miriam expected. The wind seeped through the warped boards just beneath the roofline, brushing against her back and shoulders every time it shifted. The lantern the man had left burned low now, its wick curling in on itself. She kept her arms around the children as they slept, one on each side of her, their small bodies radiating what little warmth they had. She didn't sleep. Couldn't. Her mind wouldn't let her. Each sound below, the slow creak of the barn door, the shuffle of hooves, the distant bark of a dog, sent her nerves tight again. She didn't know the man's name. Didn't know what kind of person would let strangers in his barn without asking a single question. Was he kind or just tired? Was he dangerous? Was he someone who'd regret saying yes? Her eyes scanned the interior. The loft floor was patched in places. A saddle rack sat unused near the back wall, and a few folded horse blankets leaned against a crate. It wasn't a place meant for people, but it wasn't the road either, and for that alone, she whispered thanks. She thought of Paul, the way his eyes had gone wide just before the wagon tipped, the sound Ruthie had made when she saw the blood. She tried to push the images out of her mind, but they lingered like a film over everything. At some point, the lantern below was lit again. Miriam heard the man's boots first, slow steps across packed earth. Then the clink of metal, a pot being moved, the creak of hinges, the sound of something poured into a pan. She stayed still, not wanting to startle the children. After a few minutes, she smelled it, cornmeal and beans, maybe a little pork fat. Her stomach ached. A few moments later, his voice carried up low. "If they're hungry," he said without looking up, "food's on the crate." She looked down through the gap in the floorboards. He was standing near the hearth at the edge of the barn. Someone had laid stone for a fire pit just inside. The man didn't glance up. He just stirred the pot once more, set it down, and left. Miriam waited until his steps faded completely before moving. She woke Isaac first, then Ruthie, whispering that it was all right. She climbed down the ladder carefully, her knees shaking a little from the strain. The crate he'd left the food on was clean. 2 tin bowls, a chunk of cornbread each, and a ladle of hot beans and salted meat. No words, no note, just there. Isaac didn't speak much, but he looked at the food like he didn't know if it was really meant for him. Ruthie ate slow, watching the barn door with every bite. Miriam ate last. After they finished, she wiped their mouths with a corner of her shawl and brought the empty bowls back to the crate. Then, hesitating only a moment, she opened the barn door and stepped into the yard. She saw him near the fence line, hammering a loose rail back into place. The sun was coming up behind him, casting long shadows through the bare trees. The light was flat and cold. "Thank you," she said. The man paused, nodded once, but didn't look her way. He swung the hammer again. "I don't know how long we'll need to stay," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice even. "I didn't ask," he said. She nodded. "Still." He looked up then just briefly. "I'm not a boarding house, miss." "I didn't think you were." Silence hung a few seconds longer. "You got family anywhere?" he asked finally. She shook her head. "No one close." He set the hammer down on the fence post. "You can stay until you figure out what comes next." "I appreciate that." He turned back to the fence, pulled a nail from his pocket. "I'm Reed," he said. "Miriam." A few more beats of silence. "You and the children," he said, without emotion, "can stay in the barn another night or two. But it's going to get colder. That roof won't hold off the freeze." She nodded. "We'll manage. If not," he added, "you come to the house." And then he kept hammering, the conversation over. Back in the barn, she wiped down the crate and folded the wool blanket over a rafter to air out. The children were moving now, quietly stepping between the hay and trying not to get in the way. They didn't ask questions, didn't ask about their father. Not yet. That part would come when it did. Later that afternoon, Miriam watched from the barn door as Reed saddled a mule and headed down the path toward a narrow ravine. She saw him glance back once just to check, maybe or maybe just out of habit, but he didn't wave. He didn't speak again. He just rode out into the trees with a rifle strapped across his back. Miriam spent the rest of the day mending a tear in Ruthie's sleeve, drying Isaac's socks on a nail near the fire pit, and sweeping the barn floor with an old broom she found by the stall. She didn't know yet what Reed had lost. She didn't ask why his eyes looked like they hadn't rested in years, or why he barely spoke even when he had something to say. But she felt the edges of something unspoken but heavy. A man who lived in silence, not because he enjoyed it, but because it was all he had left. She didn't push. She didn't plan. But that night, when the frost hit hard and she felt Ruthie shiver against her, she looked at the barn door and wondered, just for a moment, if he'd left it unlocked. By the time the third night settled in over the ridge, the cold had taken a different shape, less sharp, more bone deep. The barn held no heat. The hay lost its dryness. The wool blanket Reed had given them now felt damp at the edges, and Miriam knew it wouldn't keep the children warm much longer. Ruthie had started coughing, just a little, but enough for Miriam's stomach to tighten every time she heard it. She stood at the barn door for a long while that evening, watching the light glow faint through the house window. She didn't want to ask. She didn't want to feel like she was pushing the limits of what had already been given without question. But the air was turning colder than it had the night before, and Reed had been clear. When the freeze set in, the barn wouldn't be safe. The children were asleep again, curled into each other near the stacked feed sacks, their small bodies covered with Miriam's shawl and the rest of her skirts. She had nothing else to give them for warmth. She pushed the barn door open slowly and stepped out into the dark. The night was still, the kind of stillness that came after the last coyote had moved on and before the frost settled in full. She crossed the yard with her arms wrapped around herself, her boots crunching softly in the dirt. There was no light at the front of the house. She paused at the bottom step, unsure whether to knock. Before she could decide, the door opened. Reed stood inside, holding a lantern at chest height. His expression didn't change. He looked at her, looked past her toward the barn, then stepped aside. She walked in without a word. The warmth hit her immediately. A wood stove glowed low in the far corner, its orange heat pushing into the room like a slow breath. The house was small, one main room, a loft above, a narrow kitchen tucked off to the left. A rifle leaned against the wall. A pair of boots sat drying near the hearth. Everything was clean, orderly, but lived in. Practical. I didn't want to ask, Miriam said quietly, standing just inside the doorway. You didn't, Reed replied. I offered. She nodded once. He set the lantern on a table and reached for a bundle of blankets from a trunk near the wall. They can take the bed. You can sleep near the stove. You sure? I wouldn't open the door if I wasn't. She hesitated again, then turned back toward the yard. I'll bring them. Reed said nothing, just moved toward the stove and began adding wood to the fire, slow and methodical. When Miriam returned 10 minutes later, she was carrying Ruthie in her arms, with Isaac walking just behind her, sleep still on his face and a nervous glance in his eyes. They entered the house quietly. Reed didn't speak. He stepped back and let them settle in. Ruthie stirred, looked at the man for the first time in real light, and buried her face in her mother's neck. Reed handed Miriam a warm mug, just hot water, nothing added, and returned to his chair by the fire. No one spoke for a long while. Isaac sat near the stove, rubbing his hands. Miriam rocked her daughter gently. Reed watched the flames shift in the cast-iron stove, his thoughts unreadable. Then Isaac turned to him. Did you build this place? The boy asked. Reed looked at him. Nodded once. Long time ago. Why'd you stop fixing the barn roof? The question wasn't meant to accuse. It came from curiosity, the kind that only came from a child trying to understand the world again. Reed leaned forward, rested his elbows on his knees. Didn't think anyone would be sleeping there, he said after a moment. Miriam watched him closely now, sensing something in his tone. He wasn't just a man who lived alone. There had been people once. A family, maybe a wife. Someone who'd made the house quieter when they were gone. You got people? She asked gently. Reed didn't answer right away. He looked at the floor. Then the fire. Ad, he said. That was all. But the way he said it, low and certain, made her stop asking. After a long silence, Miriam stood and tucked Ruthie into the bed. Isaac followed without being told. She stayed by them until they both settled, then turned back to the main room and lowered herself near the stove. Her eyes burned from exhaustion, but she couldn't quite close them yet. You said we could stay until we figure out what comes next, she said, her voice quiet. Reed nodded, not looking up. Still stands. I won't stay longer than needed. You'll stay as long as it takes, he said firmly. Nobody's putting you out in this. Miriam didn't respond, but her shoulders eased for the first time in days. The fire crackled, and for a moment, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. She looked at Reed again. His face was different in the firelight. Still lined, still worn, but not as hard. More tired than anything. Not from age, but from carrying something alone for too long. That night, as the wind pushed against the house and the frost coated the windows, Miriam slept in warmth for the first time since the accident. She didn't dream. She didn't wake. And in the stillness just before dawn, Reed rose quietly, walked over to the rifle by the wall, and looked out the window toward the barn. Something was shifting. He didn't know what yet, but they hadn't left, and that for reasons he couldn't explain, not even to himself, meant something. Morning came slow, with a pale light bleeding through the frost-covered window panes. The house was quiet except for the soft tick of the iron stove cooling and the muffled sound of breath from the bedroom corner, where the children still slept. Miriam was already awake, seated at the edge of the room, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, hands wrapped around a tin cup of hot water Reed had left by the stove. She hadn't meant to sleep so deep, not in a stranger's house, but her body had taken rest without asking permission. She watched the embers glow and tried to steady her thoughts, still tangled with the weight of Paul's death, the long walk, and the way her children hadn't cried since the accident. Something in them had sealed up quiet, like they understood more than they should. Reed stepped in from outside, just past sunrise, wiping his hands with a rag, boots wet from melted frost. He carried a small burlap sack in one arm and a tin pail in the other. He paused at the door, noticing Miriam awake, then gave a small nod. "There's eggs and bread," he said. "Not much, but warm." "Thank you," she replied, voice hushed. "You can use the stove. It pulls left when hot. Watch the iron." She nodded and stood. He placed the supplies on the table and stepped aside. They moved around each other like two people in a space too small for their histories, both cautious, both used to silence. He didn't ask about Paul, and she didn't ask who had once shared that bedroom. It was easier that way. While Miriam cracked eggs into the pan and laid bread slices by the heat, Reed stepped out again, this time without a word. She watched him go. His steps were heavy but unhurried. He walked like a man who had nothing left to run from, but no reason to move quickly either. Isaac and Ruthie stirred shortly after. Miriam handed them warm plates and kissed the tops of their heads without saying much. Isaac ate quietly. Ruthie leaned into her mother, fingers still trembling from cold that hadn't quite left her bones. They didn't speak about the barn. They didn't ask about what came next. By mid-morning, Miriam stepped outside to hang their clothes, still damp from the night before. Across a line, she found strung between the barn and a split post. The air was sharp, but the sun, weak as it was, helped dry. She glanced toward the tree lean. Reed was there, digging post holes by hand, his coat thrown over his stump, shirt damp with sweat despite the cold. He didn't look up when she approached. "I can help," she said simply. He paused, leaned on the handle of the shovel, and eyed her once. "You don't need to. I need something to do." After a beat, he nodded and handed her a second shovel from the wheelbarrow. They worked side by side in silence. The earth was half frozen and hard to break, but she didn't complain. She'd worked land before, alongside Paul, patching fence lines and planting seed when they had a wagon route through Caldwell. She knew the rhythm. Reed noticed. "You've done this before," he said finally. She nodded. "My husband taught me." He didn't press further. He didn't say sorry for her loss. She appreciated that more than he could know. Later, while breaking for water, she finally asked the question that had lingered in her thoughts since the first night. "You said you had people. Before." Reed set the cup down, leaned forward on the porch railing, and kept his eyes on the field. "My wife's name was Ellen. Our daughter was Lorna. House fire took 'em. Long time ago now." Miriam waited. She didn't interrupt. "It wasn't an accident," he added. "Some boys got drunk, tried to steal a calf. She went out with a lamp. One of them knocked it over. Ran off before they could put it out." He didn't flinch telling it, but Miriam could feel the breath tighten in his chest. "I buried them up by the ridge." She followed his gaze. A thin tree line split the ridge from the higher ground behind the house. She hadn't noticed the stones there before. "I'm sorry," she said, quiet but firm. Reed nodded once. "I don't talk about it. I won't ask again." They both stood still, hands empty, air sharp between them. Something passed in that silence, not understanding, not sympathy, but recognition, of loss, of endurance, of continuing when nothing tells you how. By afternoon, the children had ventured out. Isaac followed Reed's mule, asking soft questions about feed and rope and hooves. Reed answered with simple nods and one-word replies. Ruthie sat by the porch steps with a stick, drawing circles in the dirt. When the wind picked up, Reed stepped onto the porch and looked at Miriam. "You and the children move into the house. No sense pretending the barn's enough." Miriam's first instinct was to refuse, but she didn't. Instead, she asked, "What do you want in return?" Reed looked at her with even eyes. "Not asking for anything. I don't like charity." "It's not," he said. "It's winter. That's all." That night, they all slept inside. Miriam laid a quilt down beside the stove. The children took the bed again. Reed took the chair near the window. Nobody talked about what it meant. But for the first time in days, Ruthie laughed, just once soft, when Isaac tripped over his own sock, trying to catch the mule's tail. And Miriam saw Reed's mouth shift just a little. Not quite a smile, but close. The days began to take shape in quiet patterns, the kind that didn't need announcing. Miriam rose early, often before the fire fully caught, and put water on the stove. She learned which floorboards creaked, how the door to the storage bin stuck if pulled too fast, and which window let the morning light hit the corner of the room where Ruthie liked to sit and watch the trees sway in the cold wind. Reed didn't give instructions, but he didn't stop her either. When she started sweeping the porch, folding the drying linens tighter, or chopping vegetables without being asked, he said nothing, just watched, once in a while, then returned to whatever task took him outside. Each day, Reed would work the outer fields or repair something that had been left undone too long. Some days he'd saddle the mule and ride the perimeter. Other days he'd spend hours mending fencing, splitting logs, clearing brush. When he came back, his clothes were streaked with dust and pine, his hands raw, and his face as unreadable as ever. The children were changing too. Isaac followed Reed often now, trailing just behind him in the yard, asking questions about tools or rope knots or what made the mule turret's head. Reed answered without condescension, short, clear replies that made the boy feel useful. Ruthie spoke less but laughed more. Her cough had eased. She spent most mornings kneeling in the yard beside the porch, rearranging stones, pretending they were cabins or fences or corrals. And Miriam, she was still figuring out what part of herself had been left behind on the road that morning Paul died. There were moments when her hands moved without thought, stirring a pot, scrubbing a pan, but her mind was somewhere else. Sometimes it was back on the side of the trail, with Paul's hand crushed under the wagon beam. Other times, it was in the barn, watching Reed from the shadows, wondering what it would take for him to speak first. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and the house glowed warm from the firelight, Miriam stood by the basin, scrubbing the last of the dinner plates. She glanced toward the window. Reed was outside, leaning against the post near the barn, watching the sky. She dried her hands and stepped outside. The wind had settled, just a breeze now, and the cold didn't bite as hard. "You always watch the sky at night?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "Sometimes," he said finally. "Old habit." She waited. Reed shifted slightly. Used to listen for horses. Thought maybe one night, the men who ran would come back. Miriam studied his face. "You still think that?" "No," he said, "but I still look." She nodded slowly. "I used to count the hours. Between meals. Between stops. Between Paul's shifts." Reed looked over at her, his eyes steady. "What changed?" "We stopped moving. Now I count the things I didn't lose." He took that in. Let the silence rest between them. "You could stay," he said, voice low. "Longer, I mean." Miriam didn't respond at first. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not." "I've got no money. No plan. Nothing but what's in that bag." Reed turned to face her. "I've lived with nothing. It's not as bad as people think." She nodded again, but didn't speak. The offer lingered there, not yet accepted, not yet rejected, just present, like the frost forming quietly on the rail between them. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, Miriam sat by the fire while Reed sharpened a blade by the hearth. The sound of stone against steel was slow, deliberate. She broke the silence. "You didn't ask how Paul died." No. Why not? Reed met her gaze. Because you're still standing. That's the part that matters. For the first time, something broke inside her, not in a way that spilled over, but in a way that let some of the weight lift. She leaned back, stared at the ceiling, and let herself be quiet. What hadn't yet been addressed earlier. Why Miriam hadn't spoken much about Paul's death. Why Reed had stayed alone so long. Why the house was still half finished in places, now began to settle naturally. Paul's death didn't need retelling in detail. Reed's solitude didn't need justification. They both understood grief didn't announce itself out loud. It shaped how a man poured water, how a woman folded a blanket, how two strangers sat without filling every silence. Before the fire burned down, Reed stood and handed her the sharpened knife. For the kitchen, he said simply. She took it, held it. Thank you. Then she added, tomorrow, I'll start mending the curtains. The drafts come through the corner seams. He nodded. The fire crackled low. The house, once a place for one, now held four. Nobody said the word stay, but nobody said leave either. And for now, that was enough. The snow came early that week, not heavy, but steady enough to turn the ridgeline white and coat the pasture in a thin sheet that crunched underfoot. The air carried a bite now that didn't leave by midday. Reed had started rising before dawn again, checking the woodpile, sealing up the cracks in the loft windows, inspecting the roof line for leaks that might let in meltwater when the sun came. Miriam watched him from the porch as she folded clothes stiff from the frost. He didn't say much in the mornings. He never had. But his movements had changed, less solitary, less mechanical. He worked the land now, with the quiet understanding that others would be in it tomorrow. Inside, the house had grown into a rhythm. Ruthie no longer clung to Miriam when she stepped out of the room. She followed Isaac around now, carrying a scrap of twine she'd fashioned into a lasso, watching as he helped Reed oil the hinges on the barn doors or spread feed by the fence. Reed never told the boy he was too small, never corrected him with sharp words. He just nodded when things were done right and handed the next task forward when they weren't. That morning, as Miriam set a pan of bread by the fire to rise, she heard Isaac ask a question that made her pause. Mr. Harlan, were you a soldier? Reed looked up from his saddlebag, then nodded once. Union, Scout, rode with the 6th Kansas. Mostly border work. Isaac blinked. Did you get shot? Reed reached down, pulled up the left leg of his trouser, just enough to show a jagged scar behind the shin. Twice. That one near Coldwater, the other in Missouri. Did it hurt? Reed's voice stayed flat, more later than it did then. Miriam turned back to her kneading, not saying anything, but the mention stayed with her. She'd suspected something in the way he moved, the cautious bend of his knees, the way he scanned tree lines, sometimes even when there was no sound. Now it made sense. Later that day, Miriam ventured to the root cellar behind the barn. She hadn't asked to use it, but she needed the jars Paul had taught her to ferment, cabbage, mostly, and leftover parsnips. The cellar smelled of clay and pine dust, the shelves neat but aged. She saw something tucked near the back, a wooden box, latched and wrapped in an oilskin. Curiosity kept her there a moment longer than she meant to, but she didn't touch it. Just looked at the name etched faint into the side, Lorna Harlan. That night, once the fire was settled and the children had gone to sleep, she found herself folding dishcloths slower than necessary, waiting for the quiet to stretch just long enough. You still keep her things? She asked softly. Reed didn't look up. A few. She liked horses. He nodded. Drew them all the time. I kept the sketches. Miriam didn't press. She didn't need to. The weight in his voice said enough. I found the box, she added, but I didn't open it. Reed finally looked at her. You could have. I wouldn't. He nodded again, this time slower. I kept it all out there because I didn't want to see it, but I didn't want to forget it either. Silence. Then she asked something she hadn't dared to before. Do you want this house to stay quiet? Reed looked at her across the table. Not sure I do anymore. They both let that settle between them. Outside, the wind pressed soft against the cabin, but the boards held firm. The fire popped once, then fell back to a quiet hum. The next morning, Miriam began restuffing the window seams with cloth and ash dust to keep the cold from seeping in too fast. Reed handed her tools without speaking. They worked side by side. By midday, the snow thickened. Miriam made a stew from dried beef and lentils, and Isaac helped stir. Ruthie fell asleep curled under the quilt she now called her own. Reed returned with his boots heavy from snow and sat by the fire, pulling off his gloves. He didn't speak until the room had quieted. "This isn't temporary anymore," he said. Miriam met his eyes. She didn't flinch. "No," she said, "it's not." The questions left unanswered in earlier chapters, whether Miriam planned to leave, whether Reed meant to let them stay beyond winter, whether his past would keep him from opening the house fully, had now answered themselves without needing a single dramatic declaration. It was in the routine, in the way their movements no longer required explanation, in the fact that no one called this a favor anymore. The next time Ruthie woke from a bad dream, she ran not just to her mother, but to Reed too. He lifted her without hesitation, and when Miriam saw it, she didn't look away. The storm came 2 nights later, not with violence, but with weight. Snow fell in long, unbroken waves, piling steady on the porch rails, the barn roof. The bare trees bowed low under its weight. The wind had turned sharper, less a breeze now and more a steady push that howled along the ridge and rattled the window panes in their frames. They prepared as best they could. Blankets were doubled, firewood stacked high by the stove, and water drawn in case the pump froze again. Inside the cabin, it was warm. The stove burned steady, casting flickers of orange across the wooden walls. The air held the smell of coffee and dried sage. Ruthie slept curled under 2 quilts, cheeks pink from the fire, her thumb pressed lightly to her lower lip. Isaac lay near her, one arm stretched over the edge of the bed, his breathing even, untroubled. Reed sat by the window, sharpening a blade again, not out of necessity, but habit. Miriam sat near the table with a thread and needle, mending a sleeve she'd patched twice already. The silence between them was different now, not filled with questions, just steady, companionable. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked, eyes still on the fabric. Reed didn't look away from the knife. "Used to, after the fire. Thought I might head toward the mountains, start over. But I didn't. Why not?" He paused. Didn't feel right starting anything again. She nodded slowly. "And now?" Reed laid the knife on the table and leaned back in his chair. "Now I wouldn't know where else to go." She looked up. "Neither would I." There had been a quiet question in the room since the end of the last chapter. Why neither of them had made plans for the future or spoken plainly about what staying meant. And here it began to take shape, not through declarations, but through admission of stillness, of being somewhere not because it was perfect, but because nowhere else made sense anymore. The next morning, the pump froze. Reed cursed low under his breath as he kicked snow from his boots and returned to the cabin, hands red from the cold. "We'll melt snow for now," he said, already pulling a kettle off the wall. Miriam didn't blink. "I'll gather. I'll take Isaac with me," Reed said. "He's been itching to feel useful." Isaac's face lit up from where he stood by the fire, and without waiting, he pulled on his scarf and mittens. While the men worked outside, Miriam used the quiet to check through the pantry, noting what was low-salt flour, vinegar, and what they had plenty of: dried beans, potatoes, a slab of salt pork she'd forgotten was tucked in the upper shelf. She began boiling snow to refill the barrels and thought about how easily she had slid into the rhythm of this place. How natural it felt to work the morning without asking. How the floor under her feet no longer felt borrowed. That afternoon, the weather cleared just enough to bring a faint blue back into the sky. Miriam took Ruthie out, bundled in scarves and gloves, to walk the edge of the pasture and gather kindling. It wasn't necessary, but Ruthie needed the sun, and Miriam needed the space to think. "Is Mr. Harlan always quiet?" Ruthie asked, dragging a stick behind her in the snow. "Yes," Miriam replied, smiling faintly. "Does he like us?" "I think he does." "Do you like him?" Miriam paused, then knelt in the snow, fixing Ruthie's scarf. "Yes, I do. Can we stay?" Miriam didn't answer right away. She looked toward the cabin where smoke curled soft above the roof, and a figure moved past the window. The question had no clear answer, but also it did. "We're not leaving yet," she said. That evening, Reed returned with Isaac, both covered in snow, boots soaked but faces bright. They'd fixed the pump's outer pipe by heating the joint with coals wrapped in tin. Isaac explained the process in short, excited bursts, using his hands and mimicking Reed's movements. "You're good with him," Miriam said later, as they sat near the stove again. "He listens," Reed replied. "He's never had a man teach him things like this." Paul was on the road a lot. "You've done just fine," he said. "I did what I could." Reed turned slightly. "You still are." It was the closest thing to a compliment either of them had given. As night settled once more and the snow began to fall again in gentler flakes, Miriam stepped outside. She looked up at the sky, then out across the field. It was still but not empty. She could see the barn roof lit in the moonlight, the old fence line she'd helped mend, the path her children had worn with their small boots. She didn't feel like a guest anymore. She felt like someone who had stayed long enough to matter. And that, for now, was enough. The weather held steady in the days that followed. Clear skies, hard frost, no fresh snow. The kind of cold that settled deeper, not with drama, but with quiet insistence, creeping into hinges, drawing breath in short clouds, stiffening the air around the corners of the cabin. Inside, the warmth held, and so did the routine. But something in the rhythm had begun to shift, not in the tasks or the silence, but in the way each gesture had taken on weight. That morning, Reed handed Miriam a folded flannel shirt. "It's stitched wrong down the side," he said. "Can't wear it like this." She turned it over in her hands. "You've kept this how long?" "Long enough." "I'll fix it," she said. She didn't ask who stitched it. She didn't ask why he'd kept it. But she knew it was Ellen's work. You could tell by the uneven hem. Loving, but imperfect, the kind of mistake that only comes from making something for someone you care about. Reed had handed it to her not just to be fixed, but because it was time. Later, while patching the seam near the window, Miriam glanced toward the table, where Ruthie was helping Isaac sort the Jared beans by color. Her own game, her own rules. Outside, Reed was chopping wood, sleeves rolled, face red from the wind. It had been weeks since they'd arrived, and not once had anyone asked when they'd be leaving. That question had lived in the shadows, among the stacked firewood, the worn blankets, the borrowed mugs, but now it was gone. Replaced by other thoughts, whether the flour would last another month, if the chickens would lay early this season, how long until the creek thawed. At mid-morning, a horse approached from the road. It was the first visitor since Miriam had arrived. Reed stepped off the porch before the rider could dismount. The man was older, town-worn, wearing a patch coat and a hat too fine for the dust it carried. "Sheriff Tolan," Reed said flatly. "Didn't expect you to remember me," the man replied. Reed didn't answer. The sheriff's eyes flicked toward the house, toward the curtains that moved slightly as Miriam stepped back from the window. "I heard tell a woman and her kids were seen heading out this way," he said. "Couple wagons from down south, said she was alone." Reed didn't respond, just stared. "She wanted?" he asked evenly. The sheriff shook his head. "No bounty, just a family name asking questions. Brothers." Said she left without word. Wanted M's angry. Miriam stepped out onto the porch then, wrapping her shawl around her. "I left," she said clearly. "No one forced me." The sheriff removed his hat. "Ma'am, your kinfolk are asking if you're alive, is all. Said your husband died and they didn't know what became of you." "They knew," she said. "They just didn't come." Silence stretched. The sheriff looked from her to Reed. "You safe here?" "I am." "You planning to stay?" Miriam looked at Reed. His eyes didn't move, but something in his jaw shifted. He didn't speak. "I am," she said again. The sheriff nodded. "Then I've heard enough." He tipped his hat once and turned his horse without ceremony. Reed watched until the man disappeared beyond the tree line, then turned and walked back toward the house. Miriam followed, slow, not speaking. Inside, she leaned against the door and let her breath come easier. "You knew he'd come?" she asked. "Eventually," Reed said. "Some folks don't know how to let go of control. They send others to do their talking." Miriam crossed her arms. "They wanted the children, not me. Thought I couldn't raise them alone. You did. I left with nothing. I didn't think anyone would help. You didn't ask for help." She looked at him. "Neither did you." That afternoon, the wind picked up again. The snow hadn't melted much, but the sun stretched a little longer across the windows. Isaac asked if he could ride the mule bareback. Reed said not yet. Ruthie made drawings in the ash by the hearth, stick figures holding hands, with a square cabin behind them and smoke curling up from a crooked chimney. Miriam watched as Reed lifted a chair to fix the loose leg, and as he turned it over, he found an old wooden toy tucked underneath the cushion, carved by a child, shaped like a bird. He held it for a moment, then set it gently back. That evening, Miriam handed him the flannel shirt. Seam fixed, buttons cleaned. "It'll hold," she said. Reed nodded. "So will we." They didn't need to say more. By now, the story had answered what earlier chapters only hinted at. Whether Miriam had left someone behind, whether danger would follow, whether she'd been running or simply escaping something deeper than a man's death. It was clear now. She had walked away from people who saw her as a burden. And now, in a place where no promises were spoken, she'd found something better than rescue. She'd found someone who stayed. The cold loosened its grip in the early days of March, not with sudden warmth, but with changes subtle enough that only those who'd lived close to the land would notice. Water that no longer froze solid in the bucket overnight, boots that left deeper prints in softening dirt, and the occasional flicker of birdsong returning from somewhere far off. The ridge above the house remained pale and frostbitten, but the path to the barn was less brittle underfoot, and the breath from the mule no longer rose in thick plumes each morning. Miriam stood at the edge of the yard with a basket in her arms, collecting kindling and twisting it into tight bundles. Her hands moved with practiced rhythm, but her mind wandered, across seasons, across what had changed. Isaac's coat was now too short in the sleeves, Ruthie's shoes too thin, and the quilts on the beds were worn smooth in spots from the months of use. These weren't burdens, just truths, signs they had stayed, signs that something had lasted. Inside the house, Reed moved about with a purpose that had settled into him lately. He wasn't a man of visible change, but Miriam could see it. The way he kept the coffee warm even after breakfast was over, how he brought in Ruthie's drawings from the porch and set them on the mantel without saying anything, or how he began sealing the cracks in the loft, a space no one had spoken of filling until now. That morning, Reed pulled a chest from the barn that had long gone untouched. Miriam saw him drag it through the snowmelt and into the house without fanfare. He opened it only once, took out a folded quilt, a child's book, and a pair of old curtains with sun-faded patterns. He didn't explain what any of it meant, but Miriam understood. He was making space, not for the past, but for something else to live where grief had sat too long. By midday, the cabin air held more warmth than before. Miriam boiled root vegetables and poured broth into the children's cups. Ruthie asked if the chickens would lay again soon, and Reed promised to help her check the nests next week. Isaac had begun asking bigger questions now. How to build fence gates, how to track mule weight by prints, what kind of seeds worked best in thin soil. "You ever thought about planting beans near the edge of the clearing?" he asked Reed at one point. Reed turned to look at him, not with surprise, but approval. "That's where we used to have a patch," he said. "Ground will hold." It was the first time he'd spoken of we out loud. That night, after the children had gone to bed and the wind hummed low against the walls, Miriam stepped out onto the porch and found Reed there, seated, coat wrapped tight, watching the sky again. "You still look for something out there?" she asked, stepping beside him. Reed shook his head. "No, just think better when it's quiet." Miriam sat on the rail beside him, pulling her shawl closer. "I used to think the quiet meant something was missing. And now it means we made it through the noise." They sat without speaking, the firelight behind them casting faint glow through the window. After a while, Reed shifted. "There's a spring further west. Not far. Clean water. Bit of land beyond it. I've kept that patch unused." "Why?" "Didn't have reason to do anything with it." Miriam looked toward the trees. "You think it'd hold a new cabin?" He nodded. "Easily. You thinking of building again?" she asked. He didn't answer, just looked at her and said, "I'm thinking about what comes next." This was the question left unspoken in the first 8 chapters. Not whether they could stay, but whether they would build something of their own. Whether this was a temporary comfort or the roots of a life remade. And here, without naming it, that question began to find shape. The next day, Reed and Isaac took the wagon toward town. First time in weeks. Miriam packed a cloth sack with food, stitched a tear in Reed's coat, and kissed Isaac on the forehead without thinking twice. He smiled when she did, old enough to feel what it meant, young enough to not question it. Ruthie stood on the porch waving until they were out of sight. Miriam spent the day airing out the bedding, sweeping the porch, boiling water for washing. She found herself folding Reed's shirt again, the one she'd mended weeks earlier, now worn softer, handled more often. In the afternoon, the wind died, and the world around the cabin settled into a quiet so full and solid, it felt like presence. That evening, just before the sky turned black and the last orange streaks dipped behind the ridge, the wagon returned. Reed stepped down first. Isaac jumped off and ran toward the porch, hands full of something wrapped in twine. "What's this?" Miriam asked, crouching. Isaac held out a wooden sign. The letters were carved unevenly, but clearly. The Cales. Miriam stared at it. "I made it," Isaac said. Reed helped with the burning. She looked up at Reed, but he said nothing. She took the sign gently, her voice low. "We're not just staying anymore, are we?" "No," Reed answered. "You're home." The first true warmth came in April. Not just in the wind, but in the soil itself, soft underfoot, smelling of earth instead of frost. The snow had long since melted, and the trees past the ridge were budding pale green, casting thin shadows on the trail that once led only to silence. Now it led to something else. The cabin windows were open that morning, letting fresh air sweep through the rooms. Curtains that Miriam had sewn from old flour sacks moved gently in the breeze. The children were outside, their laughter rising and falling between the trees. Ruthie ran barefoot. Isaac worked beside Reed near the newly marked garden bed. Stakes had been set, a fence half-built. Shovels stood in the dirt. Inside, Miriam stood by the stove, pressing her palm to her lower back as she stirred cornmeal over heat. Her body was tired in a way that felt honest. Not from fear, not from weariness, but from living, from belonging. She had asked Reed a week earlier, quietly, while they walked the creek, if he truly meant to build a new cabin beyond the spring. His answer had been simple. "I already cut the lumber." And so, one morning at dawn, they'd gone together. No ceremony, just the two of them. They stood on that empty patch, boots sinking slightly in thawed soil, and began to talk. Not about what had been lost, but about where the door should go, how many windows would be enough, where the stove would sit so Ruthie could warm her hands each morning. That space wasn't a symbol. It wasn't a dream. It was a home being built deliberately, with her in it. Now, weeks later, Reed was hammering the base frame into place. Isaac passed nails without being asked. Ruthie brought water in a tin cup. The sky overhead was cloudless, the air thick with the smell of pine and sawdust. Later that afternoon, Miriam stepped out with a wooden sign in her hands, the one Isaac had carved. She had painted over the letters with a dull red wash made from crushed berries and vinegar. The name still read the same, the Cales. She set it against a tree for now, not yet nailed to anything. But Reed saw it, paused, and met her eyes. "Not sure this place should carry my name anymore," she said softly. Reed wiped his brow with the back of his hand, stepped forward, and looked at the sign. He didn't speak right away, but when he did, his voice was clear. "It's not just your name now." She held his gaze. "We never spoke about it," she said. "Not directly. I know, and we don't have to." "No," he said, "we don't." They didn't kiss. They didn't hold each other. But they stood there side by side, and it was understood that they weren't waiting anymore, that nothing was borrowed, that the life they were building wasn't out of obligation or charity, but because they wanted it to be real. That evening, Reed prepared dinner, his hands awkward but sure, as Miriam watched from the table, smiling quietly. The stew was overcooked, the bread a little burned at the edges, but the children ate without complaint, and the room was filled with light. After supper, Ruthie crawled into Miriam's lap and whispered something barely audible. "Can we stay here forever?" Miriam looked toward Reed. He answered for them both. "Yes," he said, "you already have." That night, as the fire burned low and the children slept soundly in their beds, Miriam stepped outside one last time. The stars above were sharp, the air just cool enough to feel honest against her skin. She looked out across the field toward the new foundation, the stacked lumber, the brush they'd cleared together. The world wasn't finished. It never would be, but they weren't alone in it anymore. She turned back toward the house and closed the door behind her.